Okay, welcome everyone to another episode of KUDEN Radio. All right, so again, every new year, right? We different cultures, right? We talk about goals. People call them resolutions, right? What we want to achieve, what we want to improve, what we're committed to doing differently this year. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's a more subtle question, quieter question that almost never gets asked, right? Especially by capable, motivated, well-intentioned people, right? And we've been focused on this for a while now, right? And that question is, what assumptions am I carrying that could still cause failure, no matter how hard I work? Because in self-defense, in leadership, and in life, most failures, again, my humble opinion, right? But most failures don't happen because someone didn't try hard enough. They happen because something that worked in calm conditions stopped working under pressure, just collapsed, right? In martial arts and the self-defense realm, I've seen skilled people overwhelmed, not because they lack training, but because their training assumed cooperation, restraint, or predictability. In organizations, I've seen well-designed policies collapse. Again, not because they were poorly written, but because they assumed rational behavior when none was present. So this episode and the articles that I'm actually writing and posting behind it aren't about doing more. They're about seeing more, about identifying the hidden assumptions that survive planning sessions, that survive goal setting, and survive the best intentions, but fail when stress, chaos, or human, call it rupture, human meltdowns, collapse, when human issues enter the picture, right? So whether you're an individual working on personal mastery, on being able to protect yourself and your loved ones, or you're a leader responsible for others, this is the same clarity problem, just in different environments. And this episode of KUDEN is about that gap. Not motivation, not technique, not policy, but what actually determines success when the conditions you plan for no longer exist. All right, we'll talk about that and more as soon as we get started.
So, the big question is this: how are self-defense and success-minded people like us, concerned citizens worried about protecting ourselves, our loved ones, and the things we care about from the monsters we know exist in the world? How do we train in a way that gives us the skills, knowledge, and understanding we need without becoming paranoid fighters or killers ourselves, and yet still allows us to be the hero protector the world needs us to be? That's the question, and this podcast will give you the answers. My name is Jeffrey Miller, and welcome to KUDEN Radio. Real training for real people in a real world.
All right. Welcome to this episode of KUDEN Radio. Dashiell Miller here. Jeffrey Miller, for those of you on the consulting side. And of course, I have my trusty ninja techie sidekick, Sensei Alexander, in the background. So welcome to episode 293. Holy cow. 7 more weeks. We'll be celebrating our 300th episode. So thanks for being a part of this in some small or large way. I know I have a bunch of groupies that are on a regular basis. And I have folks that are on sometimes and as much as possible. And I have a whole slew of folks that catch us on the recording, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook tomorrow, or it's in one of the, I'd say dozens, but pretty sure we're on over 200 podcast directories. But either way, right? Regardless of whether you're catching us here live, or you're catching us later on Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you happen to catch us. Thanks for the support. Thanks for the trust in what we're getting out to everybody here. All right. So before we jump into things, James, who do we have on? Who's here? There he is. Pop up.
Well, so far, we got Kyle, Alyssa, and Rise over on YouTube have checked in. Say good evening.
Okay. Cool. All right. Feel free to pop in, say hi, those kind of things. Regardless of what platform you're on, as long as you have that capability there. If you post something in the comments, we should see it, right? At least the ones we're connected in on, right? We're in on two Facebook things, right? We're on the KUDEN podcast page. We're on my private profile. We're on YouTube. We're on X, on my LinkedIn. Professional thing, and we're on LinkedIn. Yeah, awesome. Okay. All right, fantastic. All right, so anyway, here we are. We're moving steadily, right, in 2026. So this is actually a intentionally combined episode. What I mean by combined is I will be making equal reference to both individual practitioners, folks, focused on individual personal self-defense and the protection of others from that perspective, as well as for the organizational leaders who are looking to make sure that they're covered, right? And they're not missing something that, for all of us, right, that couldn't bite us in the butt later, that we didn't miss. Okay. Of course, based on the format here, I can only cover so much, but I have a 3-article series in the works. 2 should go live tomorrow, 1 specifically for the individuals over on Online Ninja Academy, and 1 on the consulting site. Don't worry, if you're on LinkedIn or whatever, I'll have something there that points back, and same thing with the other locations as well. But this was a bit too large to do in just one thing. So, and it kind of branched out, and it was actually based on a question that one of my students who's self-employed, but gets out into the world and is in and out of different companies and those kind of things that she had. And so we did part of this Friday morning for that group coaching call from a certain perspective, but since her question was multifaceted and it applies across lines, so this episode is based on the first article that's going to go up, based on these assumptions, right? And then I have another one that's going up based on legal considerations, and another one in the series, and the title escapes me at the moment. I've been frying my brain for days working on these things. So anyway, that being said, welcome again. And so let's just kind of jump in here. Let me bring up my notes so I don't forget anything. And we'll move, right? So again, this week's episode, right? The purpose of everything I do, right, whether with individuals or organizational leaders, is the same. Right? It's the same, right? It's to help people think, act, and operate in ways that produce real results while keeping themselves and those they're responsible for safe and protected, right? Effectively. Everybody's looking for effectiveness. Anything can be effective. Dump enough money, time, effort, energy, resources into it. but not just effective, right? Efficiently and with the least amount of unnecessary wear and tear along the way. Okay. And that's the lens we'll be using for today's episode. It's the lens we use for most episodes. Okay. And again, as usual, right? My tech ninja is in the wings, right? So if you have any questions, comments, if you're looking for any kind of resources that I don't think I'm mentioning any during this one, but if you're looking for anything, you can always pop it up there and James will help you out. All right. So one of the most uncomfortable truths in self-defense and in workplace violence is that skilled, well-intentioned people sometimes lose to people with seemingly no training at all. Not because they're weak, not because their training is bad, but because the assumptions built into their training or into their planning collapse under pressure. Right? You see this in martial arts, in self-defense realm, when someone with years of practice gets overwhelmed by a chaotic, aggressive attacker. Right? You see it in organizations when policies that made sense suddenly don't matter at all. Not because no one cares about them, but because conditions, right? The danger in the moment renders them irrelevant. Okay? And in both cases, the failure doesn't come from lack of effort. It doesn't. Right? People put a lot of time and effort into these things, right? Whether it's training in a martial arts school, dojo, whatever you want to call it, right? Or it's doing the research and putting things together, right, to the best of our ability. So the failure doesn't come from that, right? So what does it come from? Well, it comes from expecting constraint. It comes from expecting self-control, self-regulation from someone who has already opted out of it, intentionally or not. Okay? So this episode is not about techniques. It's not about motivation. And it's absolutely not about blame, right? Not going to be like one of these info commercials where it's not your fault, but we have a solution. No, okay? It's about clarity, okay? It's a failure analysis episode, okay? Analysis of what? Well, about the assumptions that survive that are spoken or unspoken and survive, right? The planning stages, the preparation stages, in many cases, even the training stages, right? That come out of calm conditions, right? The assumptions that make sense to those making them, but quietly in the background, sabotage outcomes when pressure, chaos, and the moment no one wants arrives. Okay? So here's the core idea that it would be really helpful if you understood this. Okay? I'm not going to tell you have to understand it, but I highly recommend it. Okay? And that is constraint. Right? Self-control is a choice. And some attackers have already opted out of it. And that's a problem because most training, physical, professional, organizational, assumes some form of restraint. For those of you in the martial arts realm, when was the last time that you or anyone you know of practiced against somebody that was just arms flailing, no rhyme or reason to their movements, right? Came at you. Now, I usually reserve that kind of thing for upper level folks because it's hard enough for new folks to like keep their head wrapped around priorities. But again, training assumes some kind of restrained, right? There's assumptions that pain will discourage further attack. Right? We call it like a control factor, right? Pain is highly overrated. Right? It assumes that damage will cause reassessment. Right? He's going to think twice because I made something hurt. Right? This is not a blanket thing across the board. This is, there's certain people that these things don't affect. But if we go in operating as though whatever we do is a guarantee, there are no guarantees. Some things work, some things don't. Some things work on certain people, not on others. Some things work on certain people at certain times, but not at other times. What are some other assumptions, right? There's assumption that losing balance, right, for that person will create a pause. Other people, we do it, right? Go right into an ukemi, right? Go in right into a breakfall and just attack from a different level. Okay. We assume that escalation happens in stages, and somebody's not going to irrationally jump from point A to point Z. Right? There's an assumption that once someone is down, the danger is over. But in real violence, right, especially outside controlled environments, right, outside of a ring, right, outside of that kind of structure, right, on the street or other public place, right, in your car, your home, or in a workplace, right, when these things happen, depending on this person's condition, level of intent, commitment, those kind of things, pain doesn't always register. Damage doesn't always matter. Balance loss doesn't guarantee compliance. And down does not mean done. Okay? Because, right, let's face it, some attackers continue from inferior positions. Right? They just will not stop. Some keep advancing despite injury. I've got plenty of stories from my law enforcement days. Right? Some are so emotionally fixated or chemically altered that self-preservation simply isn't a part of the equation. Right? So this isn't about bad people versus good people. It's not. Right? It's about different operating logic. My advanced students and organizational clients know that we've got training that will take folks through different attacker mindsets. Okay. We've got 5 as a framework where the logic, everything from why they're doing what they're doing to how they do it, right? There's, the person who will grab you and one shot, right? Done. There's another person that's just fast and furious. There's another person that's all erratic, trying to be confusing. There's another person that, it's this haul off kind of thing. And the way they do what they do, right, changes everything, right? So if our solution, if our training is a one size fits all, and we're used to only seeing 1 or 2 or whatever of these approaches, right? Or we're basing everything on a particular mindset, then everything that we've built could end up collapsing. It could end up just being jammed up or rendered moot, right? Irrelevant. As soon as we're surprised or confused by a different approach. So, what else do we have? I already said some people keep coming at you, even if they're injured. yeah, again, it all comes down to self-preservation. If they're not concerned about their own well-being, right? There are people in the world, whether they're a part of certain organizations or clubs or gangs or whatever, that um, they absolutely believe that like life is a zero-sum game, right? Or they're in a condition where, right, they're done, they're opting out, and so they're not only okay with recognizing that they're probably not going to survive the moment, but since they have zero value on their own life, then their victim doesn't have anything either. So, appealing to compassion, appealing to, or trying to use dissuasion and those kind of things, it's not going to work, right? So again, this is not about bad people versus good people. This is not about anything other than different types of operating logic, and more specifically, a different operating logic or set of morals or ethics or influencing conditions or whatever than we operate by. And I'll talk about that in a bit, right? So the point here is that if our training, if our belief system, if our organizational policies, right, where a company or the beliefs governing training in a martial arts or self-defense school, okay, only works when the other person agrees to limits, to rules, to being fair, to social norm, whatever, right? If that's what it's based on, it will fail precisely when you need it most. Okay? So these are things that martial artists miss because the focus is on getting the technique right from the scrolls, even though there's two different types, right? There's step-by-step instructional things for that are actually models or examples of these bigger lessons, right? Um, or it's folks getting caught up in, everything should work because this is what's required for compliance, and these are best practices. Again, we'll talk about some of these things as we move on. All right. So, but let's talk about one that I've alluded to already. Actually, before I do that, here's a little story. Bunch of years ago, right, I was having a discussion with some healthcare leaders, some executives, about workplace violence training and things like that. And one of their legal team kind of came into the meeting and listened to what we were discussing and interjected, right? And he said, "Well, this is a moot point, right? This is not an issue, right? It's not even something we need to be discussing, right? Because them acting out is impossible, right? They already signed a non-aggression agreement." And I stopped and fought the impulse to just like let my jaw just drop. Uh, and I just simply asked one question: were they willing to bet their life or their safety or the safety of anybody else in their organization um, on that piece of paper? I said, just in case you're confused about the question, um, are you willing to bet your life on that piece of paper being uh, bulletproof, or that it will stop a knife or even a fist? But nothing would get them around it because their belief system was such that the contract nullified, right? Um, any possibility of physical action because the person agreed to it. And if they break that agreement, then they're going to get punished. We'll take action. It completely missed them that the damage that we're talking about averting or mitigating or responding to had already been done. Okay. So anyway, that being said, right, here's where things get subtle, right, and where good people get in trouble, right? And it's that we project our own brakes, our own limiters, right? Our own boundaries onto others. Right? This is called transference in psychology. And it's where we project our own beliefs, choices, even quote unquote common sense onto others, right? Assuming they will or should do things the way we do or the way we would, right? They know what we know, right? They hold the same values that we do. And so, right, they will think, speak, and act the way we would, right? First time I ever encountered this personally and firsthand, I was on surveillance as an investigator. And we were parked down the street from a house that we were surveilling. And it was dark, middle of the night, right? No lights on. There was a street light farther down and whatnot. Lights were on in the house, curtains drawn. And so basically, we're set up, seeing who's coming, who's going. It's just activity around the place. And next thing I know, I see the curtain part, and this guy's looking out through the window. And I dropped down in my seat. And my partner looked over and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, like, I don't want him to see us. Aren't you afraid he's going to see it?" And he said, "No. One, you need to understand how like glass and reflection and the light behind him and all that is working to affect things. Um, but do you know why you dropped like that?" And I said, "Yeah, not to be seen." He said, "No, no, no. It goes deeper than that. It comes even before the thought or worry about being seen, right? There's a pre-existing belief that's going on." And he'd been doing this stuff for years. And I said, "Okay, do tell." And he taught me about transference. You see, you know what that means? Psychobabble aside, what it means is because you know you're watching, right? You think that when he looks out the window, he knows you're watching. And so you responded to the possibility that he might see you. He's just looking to see what he can see. He's worried about being watched or if anybody's out there, but he doesn't know for sure, right? If you go doing sudden moves like that, then they could end up knowing for sure. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So, how does transference affect us within the realm of self defense, workplace violence, deterrence, anything like that, right? Well, we assume pain would stop us. So, we assume that if I apply a pressure point attack, right, Q-show attack, and right, triggers pain, it'll stop him. Okay? I have a very high tolerance for pain. Okay. You can take that limb out of the equation if you hit a certain point a certain way, and I can't fire a muscle chain. But that doesn't stop the rest of me. Now, are some people sensitive to pain? Are some people pain averse? Are some people, yeah. But there's also some people that have neurological damage or like birth conditions and or high pain tolerance or low life value kind of thing. So it's not the same. Okay. We can't make an assumption. We can transfer risk aversion, right? Since risk of damage, of reputation, or whatever would stop us, whatever it might happen to be, right? Then we assume that by employing those things, it would stop them. Different value systems, different risk tolerances, okay? Different outcome. Okay. If consequences would matter to us, right? So we expect the same logic to apply universally. And it's just, it doesn't happen that way, right? But again, it's not because people aren't trained. We have to make sure that we're not training around assumptions and leaving gaps that could cause, we want to make sure that we're not building whatever we're building, our training, our skill sets, our policies, our response, whatever, right? Like a house of cards, right? That if something doesn't go right, right? The whole thing collapses. Okay? But again, good people often fail to recognize what it looks like when someone else, right, has no internal braking system or no braking system left or in that moment. Okay? They can be perfectly rational all the time, but something, right? I talk about this with healthcare leaders when we're doing workplace violence for them, because they're atypical. They're so atypical that the FBI established a whole different subset for them because they don't fit the norm, right? Their hospitals aren't locked down typically, right? The same way companies can manage things, right? Nor to the same degree. So a whole lot of factors that make them different, right? But people that act out in that realm very rarely fit the typical profile that could be used across other realms. Okay? More often than not, we're looking at somebody acting out atypically, right? They're not normally a violent individual, or they maintain a high level of restraint to anger management issues or whatever, right? But everything from getting the wrong med in their system or a med interaction with other ones that are being taken, pain, grief, loss, undiagnosed psychosis, right? That's a volatile mix, right? So somebody can act atypically in a moment when the right stressors are applied, and then whatever rationale or predictability factors that might have been in place, they're not. Okay. So, and when I say the difference between somebody who has no internal braking system or none left, right? So somebody is, we'll call it emotionally deregulated. How about that, right? Where they've hit a breaking point. Okay, that's one of them, right? But someone who doesn't have one to begin with, that is specifically targeting either an individual themselves or some individual within a group or a group identity or whatever, didn't have one to begin with. So nothing was there to be exhausted. Okay. And if we're talking about prevention in these realms, the two types of people that I just mentioned, prevention for either is almost exactly opposite for what would be used to prevent things or to prevent the other person from acting, or to at least cause them to pause, to stall, to maybe find a different target. Okay. Again, this happens in the dojo, right? It happens in de-escalation training. It happens in HR policies. It happens in zero tolerance frameworks, right? Good people assume that escalation is gradual, right? That warning signs will be respected, that rules will be acknowledged, right? My new book that I'm working on right now is called Zero Tolerance Doesn't Work. Okay? And it's based on the premise that there's two primary attacker types that don't care about anything that all that prevention stuff is based on. Okay? And one of them uses it, right? Actually plans with it in mind. Right? But again, rage doesn't negotiate. Fixation, right, doesn't care about policy. And some actors, right, some attacker types, they don't want resolution. They want impact. They want to make a statement, right? They want bragging rights. They want to be famous or infamous, right? Again, they're acting based on wanting, who knows? They want respect. They want to be remembered. They want people to remember the cause. They want whatever, right? Regardless of whether or not they survive the moment to enjoy the results of their actions. Right? So to operate based on somebody winning, somebody losing, somebody still being around to be punished afterwards. There's a problem in the thinking. Okay. These are all gaps. These are all things that can cause everything that we're working on, all the time, all the effort, all the money, all the blood, sweat, and tears, whatever that we put into what it is that we're doing to prevent or to protect ourselves from that very thing. If we're not careful, it'll be these things. It can be these things, right? That cause the collapse, that cause the loss, right? Whatever, right? Okay. So the point here is that when you expect rational constraint from someone operating without it, right, you end up misreading intent. You delay action, right? Hesitation happens, right? And you lose time, and sometimes a lot more than time that you won't get back. Uh-huh. And this is where everything we've worked hard to learn, to build, to put in place, this is where it can collapse. Right. So anyway, this would be a good time to pause to see if there's questions, comments. James, anybody pop anything in there? Uh-oh. There he is. You really are like that sneaky tech ninja in the background, aren't you? Lurker. Anybody? Questions, comments? No?
A couple more people jumped on. James T. 681 over on YouTube. Jimmy, Dave, and Greg from Australia.
Awesome. No questions, no comments.
Nope, just the good evenings.
All right, just soaking it up. No worries. All right, so in that case, I'm just going to jump right back into things. Okay, so let's get back to talking about or exploring this untrained attacker myth. Okay, and it's not that there aren't quote unquote untrained attackers, but how are we defining trained or untrained? Okay, because most people, they didn't go through a formal program. I know some people were trained in the school of hard knocks, right? The street dojo, and just went through enough of these things and figured it out. Most people that we would consider to be untrained, still not untrained. Okay? Because every time we watch a movie, we watch a TV show, anything like that, right? We're now in today's world, people are just scrolling, binge watching YouTube videos, right? Fights, self-defense techniques, martial arts moves, all that kind of stuff, right? That stuff works its way into subconscious storehouse. And in one way or another, influences how people do things. So training doesn't have to be formal. Okay? Doesn't. But let's look at something more basic, more, I don't know, maybe even primal. Okay? So we could look at a lot of these things. We could there's a lot that could be covered, but due to time constraints, right? We're going to limit our focus on two of these failure points. Right? First, where people get the wrong lesson, right, from circumstance. Okay? I'm talking about when a trained martial artist loses to an untrained attacker. Okay, you see this all over the place, right? But when this happens, the takeaway, the lesson learned or the lesson presented is often, see, training doesn't work on the street, right? You can't do kata in a fight. Not arguing that point, right? But where I'm going with this is that you see this in programs and you see it highlighted across YouTube videos where the answer to this, right? See, it doesn't work on the street, right? The answer is you need to fight like everybody else. Okay. The organizational equivalent of using best practices, but never questioning those best practices, where they came from, or whether or not they've ever been tested or ever worked before. Interesting, right? In either case, that assumption, right, that training doesn't work on the street, right, or that the only other answer is you got to do it like everybody else, is false, right? It's based on the belief that the problem is that the attacker is untrained and won in spite of the defender's training. The real problem isn't that the attacker was trained or untrained. The problem is that the defender trained for compliance, trained for predictability and structure, while the attacker operated inside chaos, operated with persistence, nonlinear aggression, right? They were free from all that stuff. Rules, right? Being predictable, structure, right? They weren't constrained by any of those things, right? And I don't know if it's ironic or it's coincidental or it is what it is, right? Trained attackers often stay inside patterns, whether they know it or not, whether they mean to or not, right? Untrained, irrational, and committed attackers, they don't. Okay. And that's why Budo based training, like real survival based training. For those of you new to this, Budo is just a Japanese term that points to martial ways, right? Actual, I'm going to use the term warfare, but I don't mean battlefields, right? The battlefield is wherever the battle's taking place. And it doesn't have to be armies against armies. Okay. But real survival based training, not win or lose fighting. Right. And also, right, why workplace violence response mitigation preparation and training. I know it's long term, right? When done correctly in both realms, it's not about techniques or even beliefs. It is, however, about adaptation, assessment, decision making under pressure, flow based on conditions, not choreography, and correct awareness about the threat, the attacker mentality, and what it will be like when the pressure is on, not during drills, not during, play fighting, whatever. Right? The moment training becomes dependent on expected responses, it stops being survival relevant. And that's when it can become a liability problem. Before I shift to a different topic, there's another subtle failure point related to this, right? That's worth mentioning, right? I'll just very quickly, right? And that is I'm going to call it the habitual ending problem, right? And what I mean by that is many systems, martial and otherwise, teach a finish-focused mindset, right? The assumption, spoken or not, could be spoken, could be implied, whatever, right? That a technique has a beginning and an end. That a knockdown equals resolution. That victory framing equals safety, right? So all that win or lose mentality, right? that a fired employee equals problem not only solved, but vanished permanently, right? I mean, managed them, kicked them out, right? So it's unthinkable that they'd return, right? Or just like that attorney I talked about previously, right? The very fact that they signed this agreement puts any thought of the possibility of a violent outbreak or an outburst or a physical attack from this person just unthinkable, right? So this is not rare. This is not limited to any one realm. You see it in martial arts imagery, right? You see it in competitive thinking. And you even see it in how organizations define incident resolved or incident resolution, language planning, right? Key indicators, right? But survival isn't about winning. Right? And we're not splitting hairs here. Survival is about knowing when the danger has actually ended and acting according to that, right? It's about answering the question, what's next? Not, boy, I'm glad that's over. I try to maintain my calm as much as possible. My dentist has pointed out how much every time I go, my molars look a little bit lower. But I remember one time here locally where I live, and we live in a semi-rural area. There's a bunch of towns loosely connected, but you have to drive 10 to 20 minutes in any given direction, sometimes longer, to get to the next little town-ish thing, right? And so, not a big city, not, even though the crime statistics show that everything based on per capita is the same as big cities. Not number of incidents, but number per, right, percentage based on population base. But anyway, at that time I didn't have my academy, wasn't doing anything formal, just gotten out of the military and had set up locally and was teaching out of a local YMCA. And there was a serial rapist that pretty much isolated to one of our towns, and weeks on end, right? It was happening at a very specific time during the day. Very specific conditions arose and whatnot, and it's just, it was a major scare. And so enrollment in martial arts schools and self-defense classes went up, weapons sales, training, all kinds of things, right? And then they caught the guy. Well, wasn't guaranteed at that point. They caught somebody who they thought was, a good possibility, right? And immediately after the arrest, the mayor of that town stood on the steps of City Hall and announced to the press and the public that everyone could rest easy now. The rapist had been caught. Again, there's a reason my molars are in the condition they are. And immediately after that, gun sales went up in the opposite direction. People were selling them. People stopped doing training. And all those that rise in attendance at martial arts and self-defense classes, dropped off. I mean, after all, they caught the rapist. Everybody can go back to normal. Okay. Again, problematic, right? But this is why these conditions, right? This is why students are taught to back away, right? Immediately after that, the last move in a technique, or the moment they forget what to do or have too many options and they can't, right? Immediately create distance, reset things, back away, right? Reestablish kamae, right? Their defensive posture, and to maintain zanshin, right? Awareness, right? And also they're taught what to look for. Okay. They're also taught why discernment reappears at every phase of strategic self-defense. It's not just at the beginning, right? When we're tempted to ask what's happening. That's a natural response for most people, right? It's just whether they say it, they think it, or there's just that feeling of what's happening, right? And the brain has to resolve that unknown, right? It's also why we're taught that there are potentially 3 attackers in every incident. And I don't mean there's 3 physical people. Could be, but not necessarily. What I'm talking about for individuals, it's the person or persons who, you've got to survive the physical assault from, right? After that, the attacker could be ourselves, right? Could be PTSD, could be shame or guilt because we're good people and we just had to hurt another human being, all kinds of things, right? Could be having to put up with trauma or fear or concern from friends or family who, yesterday they were confident that your skills could help protect them, right? And then today, now they know that you can hurt people, and right, so now you've got a potential relationship issue, right? For organizations, you still have the same thing. You have the initial hostile event that has to be responded to, mitigated, managed, right? But the PTSD and things like that afterwards show up differently, right? In lost time, right? Lost talent, right? Whether they were damaged or worse during the incident, or you've got to replace them, or now they don't feel safe. So they either don't go to work and they're, uh, using PTO or whatever else is being offered, right? Or could people go somewhere else, and they've got to be replaced and whatnot. And again, legal's not just like the individual having to deal with the potentially deal with the legal system, right? Companies, organizations, right? It's not just legal, right? OSHA can get involved. There can be PR issues, both personally and corporate level kind of stuff. It's not as simple and cut and dry, right? So anyway, before I forget, right, if you're getting value out of these episodes, out of this level of training, right, don't forget, like, share, subscribe. Whether you think about it from the perspective of directly helping people or helping us, or you keep in mind that the algorithms on the different platforms are computer programs, and this is how we affect them so that they show things like this to other people. But either way, right, help out if you so choose, right? Okay, questions or comments to this point before we take a look at a more specific, like, organizational parallel? James, anything?
No, it looks like Maury checked in, said good evening, but other than that, that's it.
Cool. All right. Well, if you guys have any questions or comments, or let's change the tune. Maybe you don't have questions, maybe you don't have comments, or not comments in that direction. But have you had an aha moment? Are you getting value out of this? And if so, how? Right? Did I mention anything that I don't know? Maybe you felt before, but you didn't have words to put to it, or stands out as something that either you hadn't thought of, or you definitely think you've noticed and needs more attention, or the attention that it's getting needs to be shifted somehow. Okay, so all that's good as well. All right. While we're waiting for those, I'm going to jump back into things because, as usual, what do they say in the infomercials? But wait, there's more. Anyway, no, I don't want this to take a different route, right? So, as I've alluded to along the way, right, everything we talked about applies directly to organizations as well, not just individuals. Okay, companies plan for compliance, zero tolerance statements, and borrowing, right, from one source or another, pre-written best practices policies, right, which include things like banned weapons on site list, non-aggression agreements, punitive action warning policies, right, policies that assume rational actors. They assume compliance, right? Comply or don't work here anymore, right? They also comply, or they also assume that the actor who's considering or may do something, right, is actually acting from a concern for their well-being, right? All these assumptions, right, are being made as a means of maintaining order, and I get it, right? Prevention assumes time, clarity, and cooperation. And when those assumptions hold, things work, right? But the most damaging incidents occur when those assumptions collapse simultaneously. Okay? When rage overrides consequence, when targeted intent ignores policy, I don't care what you're going to do to me afterwards. What I care about is doing this thing to that person or these people or this place, right? Time compresses and people don't have time to think straight. Okay. Drills are normally done in a very orderly fashion. People are not under the adrenal response, those kind of things, right? And information fragments, right? And what I mean by that is that memorized do and don't lists, techniques, processes, and whatnot, right? They crumble, or worse yet, they bleed into each other. And that's why prevention alone is not enough. It's absolutely necessary, right? Because it's going to filter out most, right? But with the things that we're trying to deter, it's not enough. Right? Just like with individuals, like, people knowing that you're a black belt or that you're a martial artist, or whatever, that deters a lot of people, right? And let them assume that, you've got skills that, they don't want to test or whatever. You don't have to say it. You don't have to even imply it, right? Most people will make that assumption by themselves. Okay. And that prevents a lot of possible problems. But it also piques the interest of others. Okay. So the problem isn't prevention or safety policies or things that we do to stay safe, locking doors, all that kind of stuff, right? A lot of people, they've got double, triple locks on their front doors. You got a house with all these locks on the door, security system and whatnot. I do, right? Cameras around my castle, all that stuff. But then they've got a really nice decorative beveled or stained glass or whatever, inlay in their front door. Okay. Well, it's all great. Okay. But like the glass can be broken and the person can just walk through the hole. But what they're counting on is, and it's true. can definitely be part of a prevention strategy, is that most bad guys don't want to make a lot of noise. But what about the one who doesn't care? Okay. What about the person that shows up at a school and so there's a little buzzer, which procedures are questionable, but isn't going to use the buzzer. Going to take a shotgun to the glass, tempered glass at the door, and then just walk in. Right? Again, now what? Okay. So again, it's not that certain things are not there. We'll talk about this here in a little bit. That it's just when these things fail, they fail catastrophically. But again, I'm not talking about tactics. I'm not talking about processes or anything during this episode. What I'm talking about is mindset. And what I'm talking about is belief systems that can set us up for the collapse. Okay. So again, there's reasons why prevention is not enough, right? And why response under stress, why human behavior and understanding human behavior under collapse determines outcome. Okay. This is the critical piece that ties it all together, right? That I want you to remember. Okay? Write this down if you need to, right? People plan correctly for the world they know. Survival, physical or organizational, depends on functioning in the one they hope never arrives. They're not the same. I'll say it again. People plan correctly for the world they know. Survival, again, physical, right, individual, or organizational, depends on functioning properly, right, in the one they hope never arrives. Okay, this is why individual students need experienced and not just trained teachers. Right, it's why organizations need not just compliance and best practices centered prevention or prevention specialist, right, but response mitigation specialists as well, right? Because the experienced self-defense teachers and response specialists both have something the others don't. And that is experience with actual violence and the logic and clarity needed to navigate and survive the situation when those logical deterrence and prevention plans fail, right? They're there to help you minimize damage when logic and theory don't just fail, they're rendered irrelevant because in the new condition, they don't apply, right? Just like the martial arts teacher with actual real world experience, right? Both of these folks share perspective, right? They like in the academy, right? When students come to class, right? Part of my job, part of the instructor's job, is to discuss intent and attacker mentality and variables and things that most students have no clue about. They have no idea how some of these folks operate. Right? It's the same thing with mitigation and response. The folks with experience can point out not just gaps. We're not talking about a gap assessment. We're talking about gaps in understanding that happen or that exist when violent people are doing what they're doing, right? When the enraged, emotionally dysregulated individual, right, is not fully in control of themselves, okay? Or the person who is targeting a person or an organization or whatever, cold, planned, methodical, right? Especially if they're outside that realm, right? And they have no information about, no skin in the game on, or no concern for any kind of zero tolerance policies or what's not allowed on site or what behavior's not tolerated, or it's just not a part of it. Okay? Again, this is both in the individual realm and the organizational realm as well. Right? This is not either or. Right? This is principle based. This is right? So. What does real preparedness look like? Well, in the time frame that we have here, and we're going to make this fairly short, right? Real preparedness is not calm meditation, right? If we're all calm around here, everybody gets along, that kind of thing, right? It's not perfect policy. It's not feeling confident and ready. Right? Plans may be based on feelings, but feelings are not strategies, right? Readiness and confidence are feelings. Let's be very clear about this, okay? When somebody goes, oh, I feel like I'm ready. I feel pretty confident that I can handle those things, right? I'm not saying they are or they aren't, but readiness and confidence are feelings. Preparedness is a process, right? Designed to ensure an outcome, right? And it's not collecting techniques. Right? Preparedness is adaptability under pressure. It's judgment when structure dissolves. Right? It's constraint recognition in myself and others, right? And whether or not that's actually that exists in the moment, right? And it's understanding consequences beyond the moment of action. Right? Technique is secondary to decision making, right? Form is secondary to function. And assumptions must be tested. Or if we're not careful, right, they will betray us. Okay? So whether you're an individual or an organization, right, preparedness begins where assumptions end. Okay? In the same way that many individuals assume it's the job of the police to protect them, right? And I know I'm singing to the choir with folks that show up for this thing, right? But we know, right? We've talked to them, we've run into them. Again, they assume it's the job of the police or the government or whatever to protect them, and then they feel shocked or betrayed when the police aren't present at the moment the attack occurred. Right? You know the saying, right? Probably in a donut shop somewhere, right? But in the same way that those people have that belief, organizations often assume that if something could not be prevented, then liability simply disappears, right? There was nothing we could do about it, so it was not our fault, right? We can't be held responsible. But that's not how reality works. Right? When prevention fails or was never a factor, liability doesn't go away. It changes shape. Okay? Because once conditions change, expectations change. And if anything, right, unmanaged response, training gaps, and decision failures after prevention collapses tend to increase exposure, not reduce it. Okay? And this is what we train for. Managing conditions, responding to what's happening to prevent total and total collapse, right? And mitigating damages, right? Reducing them to the greatest extent, right? This is what we examine. The reality of violence, conflict resolution, right? And rebounding quickly in the face of something that could not be prevented, but was happening anyway, right? During a collapse, nobody asks, right? Why did the person do it? Well, lots of people ask those things, but they don't matter. Right? Everybody wants to form committees and stuff. And why did it happen? And how can we prevent it from happening again? Everybody goes back to prevention. I get it. We all want to feel safe and comfortable, but prevention can often be, it can be a comfortable trap. Okay? Because if we put things in place that are supposed to prevent it, well, then we don't have to think about it ever again. Okay? Just like the martial artist who believes that because they have all the skills and they have all the things that will help them survive a brutal attack, well, then they don't have to pay attention, or they think it gives some kind of a license, right? Like I can protect myself if I'm jumped in a dark alley, but then they go making bad life decisions, right? And they think that that's some kind of license to just walk down any dark alley, or start talking to people any way they want, because what's he going to do? Smack me? Maybe something worse. Maybe when you're not looking. Okay? So the question isn't for organizations, right? It isn't about prevention, and for the individual, isn't about having techniques and skill sets, right? It's about, are you clear about the conditions that will exist when prevention fails, or when it's not even relevant, right? And for the individual, it's not about whether or not you have techniques or skills. It's whether or not you can match them to the actual problem, the actual attack, the actual assault that's coming at you. Not just the way things are done in the dojo or the self-defense class. Okay? So where are the assumptions? Okay? What does our policies and our plans and our compliance and best practices and whatnot say about those assumptions, right? What gaps are left? What does how we train say about what we're silently preparing for? What do we assume will be or not be present, possible, until we uncover them? Maybe it's more about feeling than it is about function. Okay. So that's what I have for you for this episode. Let's just turn everything over to the folks that are on live. What do we have, James? Questions, comments, anything before we wrap this up?
Greg said, mindset. It's a mindset, not a technique issue. Awareness, etc.
No, that's a good point there, and I agree. We have this in, and this is not a plug for anything, right? But we have this in the danger prevention tactics. Used to be a DVD, now it's just a video. That somebody came to me to partner up to do this thing right after the 9/11 incident. And again, no physical techniques like the way most people think of physical self-defense, right? There are techniques for what to do during, like, if you're in your car and it's your car is being swarmed at a red light, or it's a bump and rob kind of situation, those kind of things, right? So there are techniques, just not the way people see them as a one-on-one fighting kind of thing. All the things that lead up to it's if you have our PX8 or PAR system worksheet, some of you know it as the 8 phases of strategic self-defense strategy, and or not strategy, 8 phases of self-defense strategy, and it's also our framework for training. It's a good section of phases 1 through 3, right? General awareness, situational awareness, they're not the same, and escaping to safety. One of the primary premise premises. With that and for that is like everybody's told to pay attention. But if you don't have a baseline, if you can't establish a baseline of what's normal in the environment that you're in, and you don't know what actually signals danger, then we're either like paying attention to as much as possible, but that can create system overload. It can actually dull the senses because too much stuff is coming in, right? Or we could end up becoming paranoid, or the previous one where system is overloaded and whatnot is called hypervigilance, right? So you're looking for anything and everything, and you're less likely to see the actual thing because your brain is not designed for that. It's not. You can only hold 7 or 8 pieces of information in your left brain at any given time, and as something new comes in, other things get bumped out. Okay, so unless you learn to use the right brain functions that are multi-layered and more spiderweb-like, and that operate. I mean, we tend to not call that thinking. We tend to call it intuitive or intuition and things like that. And there are ways to do this, right? Like again, establishing a baseline of normal kind of pre-codes what I call the human defense mechanism, right? It's pre-wired. We were born with it. Okay. And so the amygdala then is at stasis, right? It's our early warning mechanism, right? We code it to everything from not wanting to deal with certain things, or we pre-code it with what we determine to be danger, right? And it doesn't have to be like physical things out there, right? Like the Tyrannosaurus Rex is going to eat us kind of thing. It could be, we had a dip in income. We had, problem in a relationship or whatever, right? And there's certain fears that if we have them, the amygdala fires as a signal for danger. But back to the situational awareness kind of things. If we could establish a baseline of normalcy, then when something breaks that, the amygdala can pick it up, okay? Because the amygdala, right, very, very, is a primitive section of the brain, right? But there's this whole other section. It's actually on both sides of your head, right behind your ears, on your brain, right? Called Broca's region, right? If your mom or anybody's ever told you that with you, it's like one in one ear and out the other, like you can't remember anything, okay? That's Broca's region. Okay. So Broca's region filters out all the redundant stuff that happens every day on a regular basis. Okay. Or if you try the hypervigilant route, it will filter out a whole bunch of stuff that seems to be the same, that seems similar. Right. And so what you end up doing is creating a disconnect, a dissonance between your early warning system that when it fires or when it triggers, it immediately sends messages to your hypothalamus, and then that starts dropping chemicals and whatnot into your system. Very, very simplistic definition here, right? To get you into that fight, flight, or freeze state to be able to act, right? But if we're not managing these systems properly, then just end up with bad wiring, right? And then we end up trained, but as indecisive as untrained people. Okay? And that kind of runs contrary to what we're trying to do. All right. Anyway, I don't want to keep jumping on that. James, what else? Anything else?
Dave's was intent, one of the most forgotten elements.
Yeah. Maybe I just have weird hobbies, right? But I've studied and I even share things with students on a regular basis, like facial microexpressions and there's all these cues and whatnot, body language, facial expressions, head tilt, and things like that that signal impending aggression, right? But I've taken it farther back from that to be able to tell when somebody's telling the truth, when somebody's lying, or when somebody's masking either truth or lie. Right? I may not know what they're lying about, but okay, because there are these combinations of facial muscles that you can't consciously control. So when people try to do one thing or the other, right, that disconnect, that mismatch is what we call a mask. Okay. Because there are certain things that fire for authenticity. Okay. And like when we say your body tells on you, we're not kidding. Okay. The more of those things that we can know about and know how to properly read, the less likely we are to be surprised or to be guessing or, I don't know, that belief. There's nothing you can do about it. Right? Violence is random. It's just going to happen. Yeah, but the belief that somebody just snaps, comes out of nowhere, that's not true either. Okay? Rarely. And we're talking like in the single digit percentages that things can even look like that. There's a difference between it looking like that something came out of nowhere, and it coming from outside of our conscious awareness, right? Or outside of our knowledge base where we don't know what to look for. We don't know what flags are already present, right? So again, if we could know those, prevention now becomes more proactive and not treated like it's a blanket or like a security blanket or a shield. Okay. We warned everybody, don't do it, or you'll be fired, or you go to jail, or whatever. Okay. Again, that stuff only works when somebody cares. Yeah. The enraged person, not even thinking about it. The committed person doesn't care. As a matter of fact, they're kind of hoping that you have those things in place because that signals little to no resistance, and I can get things done, or a lot of it, before I'm stopped. And in either case, if neither of them is focusing on consequences in the aftermath, response and mitigation is all you have, because the rest of the stuff is irrelevant. Okay? I just mentioned it again last week in class, reminded my adult students, okay, that the assumption or the belief that others, including bad guys, are concerned because you're trained. The vast majority of criminals, based on what they've seen in the martial arts world, and this is on surveys, this is out of interviews, this is not my belief. This is out of the horse's mouth, so to speak, right? They're not concerned. Now, you could surprise them, right? But they're not concerned. As a matter of fact, if they find out, then they're even less concerned than they were when they were maybe vetting you as a possible target. So my lesson to students is you have to be the one that surprises them, not because you believe that you're better, not because you believe you're different, but because you have prepared for an actual situation and not some win or lose event. Okay? Because until we stop defining these things as safety, as win or lose, as self-defense, okay? Not that they're not those things, but until we stop defining them in that direction, individually and organizationally, and start recognizing that they are survival problems, then that's the first assumption that is going to cause a collapse. Okay. What else, James?
The last one was from FSM Tower. on YouTube said we must be ready to be attacked in any position at any time and place. An attack may come when we are seated, walking in our homes, or in public.
I understand the message behind that, but I would personally, I'm not a big fan of the whole ready thing, because not only are we easy to kill, or I'm sorry, that might have offended YouTube algorithm, might be easy to unalive. Anyway, but again, I said this earlier, readiness is a feeling. Okay. I have to make sure my training includes defending from those positions effectively. Okay. And when we say, we have to be careful that we're not, there's a legal term, void for vagueness. And what it means is, if we're too vague, if what we're talking about or what we're focusing on is too general, then it doesn't matter. Okay. So when we say seated, okay, how particular are we with making sure that we are training from as many different seats as we could find ourselves in? Okay. The booth at the restaurant as opposed to a chair with rollers on it as opposed to one that it just is not. And then the floor surface, is it hardwood or tile or whatever, something smooth that non-rollered chair can be slid on easily, right? And have we checked it when we sat down? How does this affect, or how does this work on the surface that it's sitting on? Right? It just looks like you're scooching around when you sit down, right? It just looks like you're trying to make yourself comfortable. Okay? Unless you're like doing weird stuff, right? But you can make this blend in. Okay. How does that work? Just like the same thing with wearing different shoes, okay, on different surfaces during different times of year. Okay. Well, you need to be trained on grass and dirt. Okay. So weather conditions, early morning, dew-soaked grass. At what point before, during, or after rain? What season? How saturated is the ground? I know it sounds like being nitpicky, but my life depends on me getting this right. Okay. And this leads to another assumption. Good enough. What exactly is that? Okay. So what else we got, James? Anything else?
That was it.
That was it. All right. Well, I hope this was valuable. If so, leave a comment now or later. Yeah, that's what I have for you this time around. So, James, am I forgetting anything, sir? No, I don't think so. Okay. Well, again, thanks everybody. I appreciate it. Again, hopefully this was valuable. Hopefully it gave you a little bit more insights and whatnot. And please remember, right? It's one thing to know something to be true, or know that certain training is necessary or important or whatever. Okay. But if we don't do it consistently, right, to where it gets into muscle memory, it's void for vagueness. Okay. If we assume that any given posture, prevention, policy, my forte is grappling, not so good at punching and kicking. Well, okay, then you have to hope that you can get your hands right on this person. Okay? So, because wherever our belief or our assumptions collapse, right, that's what we're left with. And we can either function in that space, in that environment, in that circumstance, or we can't. Okay. All right. That's what I have. Thank you very much. We will see you next time on KUDEN.
Get more of KUDEN Radio, subscribe through your favorite podcasting site, or join our clan of serious modern warriors at onlineninjaacademy.com.